Most people think the universe is silent, but that night I learned something was watching me. Ethan Carter tasted metal in the back of his throat as the wind slammed into him like a moving wall of ice. The storm screaming across the frozen plains at nearly 70 miles an hour, while razor grains of alien snow rattled against the cracked visor of his exploration helmet. Each breath inside his suit sounding louder than the howling sky above him. His display flickered red across the inside of the glass. Oxygen levels dropping faster than they should have. The numbers sliding downward 1 percentage point at a time like a countdown. He couldn't stop. 2 miles from his shuttle. That's what the navigation beacon insisted. 2 miles might as well have been 200 in weather like this. Ethan forced one boot in front of the other, each step sinking into drifts that reached past his knees. The gravity of the planet just heavy enough to make every movement feel like dragging through wet sand. The planet had no official name yet, just a catalog number from the Terran Survey Network, but the research station back on Mars had started calling it the Quiet World. No cities, no signals, no signs of civilization. Just endless frozen rock and strange electromagnetic readings buried beneath the ice. And somehow, Ethan had convinced himself that coming here alone was a good idea. His suit groaned as another blast of wind shoved him sideways, the servos in his boots whining while they tried to stabilize him on the slick surface. "Easy, easy," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding distant inside the helmet. The temperature outside hovered around -60 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds if the suit failed. His fingers tightened around the strap of his sensor pack as he stumbled forward again, eyes locked on the faint blue beacon pulsing through the storm somewhere ahead. Then the ground shifted beneath him. His boots slipped against hidden ice, and suddenly the world tilted, the horizon spinning as he crashed down onto the frozen surface with a dull thud that rattled through his ribs. For a moment, he just lay there staring up at the swirling gray sky, the storm whipping across his visor like ghostly smoke, while warning alerts blinked along the edges of his display. Oxygen, 30%. Power reserves, critical. Ethan let out a slow breath that fogged the inside of the glass. "Great job, Carter," he muttered. "Brilliant expedition." He tried to push himself upright, but his arms trembled under the weight of the suit and exhaustion. That's when the storm did something strange. The wind shifted. Not weaker, just different. The snow that had been blasting sideways suddenly curved around something standing between him and the storm. Ethan blinked through the swirling ice. At first he thought it was a rock formation rising from the snow, tall and slender like a pillar carved from blue stone. But rocks didn't move, and rocks definitely didn't glow. A figure stepped forward through the blizzard, impossibly calm in the screaming wind. She was tall, easily a foot taller than Ethan even while he struggled on one knee, her skin shimmering a deep luminous blue beneath the ghostly light of the storm. Long strands of pale silver hair drifted around her face like threads of starlight caught in slow motion, untouched by the wind that battered everything else on the frozen plain. Ethan's mind tried to label what he was seeing, scientist instincts kicking in even through the fog of hypoxia. Alien, humanoid, unknown species, possibly indigenous. But none of those words explained the way the air itself seemed to shift around her, like the storm recognized her presence. The woman looked down at him with eyes that glowed a soft amber through the swirling snow. Not angry, not curious, just careful. Ethan tried to speak, but the words stuck somewhere between his lungs and his throat. His visor warning flashed again. Oxygen, 26%. The blue-skinned figure tilted her head slightly, studying him for only a second longer before she reached down and grasped the front of his suit with surprising strength. Ethan barely had time to register the movement before she pulled him upright as if he weighed nothing, turning him toward a dark opening in the ice wall behind her that he somehow hadn't seen before. A cave. Shelter. The wind faded instantly as she dragged him inside. The howling storm cut off the moment they crossed the threshold. Ethan collapsed against the frozen stone floor, chest rising and falling as his suit struggled to stabilize his oxygen levels. For a few seconds, he could only stare at the dim blue glow reflecting off the cave walls. Then he looked up. The cave entrance stood empty. No blue skin, no silver hair, no glowing eyes. Just the distant scream of the storm outside. Ethan blinked slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears, because he could have sworn someone had just saved his life. The first thing Ethan Carter noticed when he woke up was the silence. The storm was still roaring outside somewhere beyond the cave entrance, but inside the frozen chamber the air felt strangely calm. The only sound coming from the soft mechanical hum of his life support system struggling to stabilize after the brutal trek across the ice. His visor display flickered slowly back to life in front of his eyes, oxygen levels climbing one careful percentage at a time, while the internal heaters in his suit pushed warmth back into his numb fingers. For a moment, he simply lay there on the cold stone floor staring at the ceiling of the cave, watching faint crystals of ice glitter in the dim blue light leaking in from the entrance. Then memory returned all at once. The storm, the fall, and the figure in the snow. Ethan pushed himself upright with a slow breath, his muscles stiff from the cold as the servos in his suit assisted the motion. The cave was larger than he expected, stretching nearly 30 feet into the ice wall, its curved interior smoothed by centuries of wind carving through the frozen planet. There were no obvious tools, no signs of technology, no footprints in the thin dusting of snow that had blown in from outside. If someone had dragged him here, there should have been marks in the frost. There were none. Ethan sat there for several seconds, studying the ground carefully while the scientist in his mind tried to organize the impossible image he remembered. A tall figure, blue skin, silver hair moving through a storm that had nearly knocked him unconscious. He reached up and wiped the remaining frost from the outside of his visor, then slowly turned toward the cave entrance. Pale gray daylight filtered through the swirling snow outside, the storm still pushing thick curtains of ice across the landscape. For a moment, he thought he saw movement again, something tall standing just beyond the wall of wind. But when he blinked, the shape vanished into the drifting white. Ethan let out a quiet breath. Hypoxia could cause visual distortions. Extreme cold could also interfere with perception. That explanation would have been comforting if his suit telemetry had not recorded something unusual during the final moments before he collapsed. He tapped the side of his wrist console, and the recording replayed across the inside of his visor. External thermal spike detected. Unknown biological signature. Distance less than 3 feet. Ethan stared at the numbers slowly scrolling across the screen. 3 feet. Something had been standing almost close enough to touch him. A strange feeling settled in the back of his chest. Not fear. Not exactly curiosity either. It felt more like the uneasy awareness of being watched. He stood carefully and moved toward the entrance of the cave, each step echoing softly against the frozen stone. Outside, the storm had begun to weaken, the wind dropping to a low growl as the endless plain of white ice stretched across the horizon. His shuttle beacon blinked faintly on the edge of his navigation display, still 2 miles away. He was about to step out into the open again when something caught his eye. A line of shallow impressions in the snow about 20 feet from the cave. Not human footprints. They were longer, narrower. The shape of them curved slightly as if the person who made them moved with long, graceful strides rather than heavy steps. Ethan crouched near the entrance and studied the marks through the drifting snow. They appeared for only a short distance before fading completely into the storm, as though whoever made them had stepped out of the blizzard itself and then disappeared back into it. He straightened slowly, scanning the empty ridges of ice beyond the cave. Nothing moved across the frozen world now. No shadows, no blue skin, no silver hair glowing in the wind. Yet the quiet certainty remained in the back of his mind that he had not imagined what happened out there in the storm. Somewhere beyond the endless ice, the mysterious figure who saved him was still out there watching. The wind had nearly died by the time Ethan Carter finally stepped out of the cave, leaving behind a wide frozen silence that stretched across the alien world like a sheet of glass. The storm clouds were still drifting across the sky, but the violent gusts were gone now, replaced by a slow whisper of air that carried loose crystals of ice across the endless white plain. Ethan adjusted the seal on his helmet and glanced down at the strange footprints again before stepping forward. They were still there, faint but unmistakable, pressed into the snow with long, elegant strides that did not match any species listed in the Terran Survey database. Each mark stretched almost 12 inches in length and spaced far enough apart to suggest someone tall had made them. Someone graceful. Someone who had been close enough to save his life and disappear before he regained consciousness. Ethan moved slowly across the snow, scanning the horizon through the tinted visor of his helmet. The footprints continued for another 30 feet before fading into a patch of wind-blown frost where the storm had erased the trail completely. Beyond that point there was nothing but untouched ice stretching for miles. He straightened and exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog inside the visor. "So you are real," he murmured quietly, his voice echoing faintly inside the helmet. The strange thing was that the feeling of being watched had not gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger now that the storm was gone and the world around him stood silent. Ethan tapped his wrist console again and replayed the thermal anomaly from earlier, the brief flash of life detected only 3 feet from his body while he lay unconscious in the snow. The numbers did not lie. Something had been there. Something warm enough to show clearly against a planet that averaged negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit on its surface. He turned slowly in a full circle, scanning the frozen ridges surrounding the cave. The terrain here formed shallow cliffs and sloping mounds of ice that rose like frozen waves across the landscape, creating dozens of narrow sight lines and shadowed gaps where someone could easily observe from a distance without being seen. Ethan stepped away from the cave and began moving toward his shuttle beacon again, each careful step crunching softly in the crust of snow. The navigation display indicated 1.8 miles remaining. Normally, that would have been a short walk. On this planet, every mile felt like crossing a continent. The pale sun of this distant system hung low above the horizon, casting long silver reflections across the ice fields. As he walked, Ethan noticed something unusual about the surrounding cliffs. Lines carved into the frozen rock. At first, he assumed they were natural fractures caused by shifting temperatures, but the patterns were too deliberate, too symmetrical. He moved closer to one of the ridges and brushed away a thin layer of frost with his gloved hand. Beneath the ice were smooth channels etched deep into the stone, forming curved shapes that almost resembled symbols. The scientist in him immediately leaned closer, curiosity replacing fatigue. These were not random cracks. They were deliberate markings. Old ones. Possibly ancient. Ethan activated the scanner on his wrist console and passed it slowly across the surface. The device hummed softly while analyzing the mineral structure of the rock. The results appeared a moment later across the inside of his visor. Estimated age of carving, several thousand years. Ethan stared at the numbers for several seconds. Thousands of years meant civilization, culture, intelligence. The quiet world might not be quiet at all. A faint movement caught his eye then. Not in front of him. Above. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the top of the nearby ice ridge, nearly 30 feet higher than where he stood. For the briefest moment, he saw a tall silhouette standing against the pale sky. The shape was slender and unmistakably humanoid. Long hair drifted behind the figure like silver threads in the wind. And then it was gone. The ridge stood empty again, as though no one had ever been there. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken inside the suit. He took one slow step forward and looked up at the empty ridge again. Whoever she was, she had not gone far. And for the second time since the storm began, he realized something important. The mysterious figure was not following him by accident. She was watching him on purpose. The figure on the ridge vanished so quickly that Ethan Carter almost convinced himself it had been another trick of the cold, yet the quiet certainty in his chest refused to disappear. Someone had been there. Someone tall enough to stand against the pale sky and watch him without making a sound. Ethan kept his eyes on the ridge for several seconds longer before slowly stepping closer to the base of the frozen slope. The surface of the ice rose nearly 30 feet above him, steep but not impossible to climb. Thin ridges of stone protruded through the frost at irregular intervals, creating natural footholds that a careful climber could use. He studied the slope while the wind brushed lightly across the snow around his boots. The same feeling returned again, that strange awareness that he was not alone out here. Ethan tilted his helmet upward and spoke aloud, even though the empty landscape gave no sign of listening. "I know you are there." His voice sounded calm inside the helmet, steadier than he expected. The only response was the faint whisper of wind sliding across the frozen plain. No movement appeared on the ridge. No silver hair drifting above the ice. Yet he knew what he had seen only moments ago. Ethan stepped forward and began climbing the slope. The gravity of the planet pulled gently against his suit, while the boot servos adjusted for traction on the slick surface. Each step pressed deep marks into the frost as he moved upward, using both hands to steady himself against the exposed rock ridges. Halfway up the incline, he paused to catch his breath and glanced back across the frozen landscape. From this height the world looked even larger. Endless plains of white stretched beyond the horizon, broken only by scattered cliffs of ancient ice that shimmered under the pale sun. Somewhere out there, hidden among those ridges, was the mysterious figure who had dragged him into the cave during the storm. Ethan resumed climbing and reached the top of the ridge a minute later. The surface above was flat and wide, a long plateau of packed snow and polished ice that reflected the cold light of the sky. For a moment it appeared completely empty. Then Ethan noticed the tracks. They crossed the plateau in a long, graceful line, spaced farther apart than human steps, and curved slightly at the edges, as if the person who made them moved with a natural elegance. The prints continued for nearly 50 feet before disappearing again at the far edge of the ridge, where the ground sloped downward toward another valley of ice. Ethan knelt beside one of the marks and studied it closely. The indentation was deep enough to suggest considerable height and balance, but surprisingly light for someone tall. Whoever she was, she moved like someone who understood this planet perfectly. He straightened and followed the direction of the tracks with his eyes. The valley beyond the ridge stretched nearly a quarter-mile wide, its floor covered with smooth frozen sheets that glimmered like glass. The cliffs surrounding it were marked with the same carved lines he had discovered earlier, ancient symbols etched into the stone thousands of years ago. Ethan felt a quiet realization forming in his mind as he looked across the silent valley. This was not random terrain. It was a place that had been shaped by intelligence long before humans ever discovered the planet. The wind shifted gently across the plateau then, carrying a faint sound with it. Not the howl of the storm. Something softer, almost like movement. Ethan turned slowly toward the far edge of the ridge. A tall blue figure stood across the valley nearly 200 yards away, perfectly still against the glowing ice. Silver hair drifted behind her in the wind, while amber eyes reflected the pale light of the sky. She was watching him again. For several seconds neither of them moved. Ethan raised one gloved hand slowly, not in warning, but in greeting. The blue-skinned woman studied him silently from across the valley. Then, just as suddenly as before, she stepped backward into the shadow of the ice cliffs and disappeared from sight once again. For several seconds, Ethan Carter remained standing on the ridge with his hands still raised in the empty air, staring across the valley where the blue-skinned figure had vanished into the shadows of the ice cliffs. The wind brushed lightly against his suit as if nothing unusual had happened at all, yet his pulse continued beating faster inside his chest. She had been real, not a hallucination, not a trick of the storm. A living being standing 200 yards away watching him with eyes that glowed like warm amber against the frozen world. Ethan slowly lowered his hand and stepped toward the edge of the ridge. From this angle, he could see the valley floor more clearly, a broad stretch of smooth ice that reflected the pale sunlight like polished glass. The distance between them had been significant, but not impossible to cross. 200 yards was less than a quarter mile. On Earth it would have taken only a few minutes to close the gap. On this planet, every step required caution. Ethan began descending the slope toward the valley, carefully placing his boots on the frozen surface while the suit's servos compensated for the reduced traction. As he moved downward, he kept his eyes fixed on the section of cliff where the mysterious woman had disappeared. The rock wall there curved inward, forming a natural corridor between two massive towers of ice. If she had gone inside that passage, there were dozens of places where she could remain hidden while still observing the valley below. The thought did not make him uneasy. Instead, it deepened his curiosity. Ethan reached the valley floor and paused for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of his suit systems. The silence of the planet felt almost unnatural after the storm. No birds, no distant engines, no signs of human activity anywhere across the horizon. Only the faint whisper of wind sliding across the frozen plain. He began walking toward the cliffs. Each step echoed softly through the ice beneath his boots. Halfway across the valley, he noticed something unusual again. More carvings. The same ancient symbols etched into the stone that he had seen earlier along the ridge. They stretched across the base of the cliffs in long sweeping patterns that curved like flowing lines of script. Ethan approached one of the markings and brushed away the frost with his gloved hand. The grooves were smooth and precise, carved deep into the rock with tools far more advanced than primitive stone blades. Whoever created them had known exactly what they were doing. His wrist scanner hummed quietly as he passed it across the surface. The display returned the same estimate as before, several thousand years old. Ethan leaned closer to examine the shape of the symbols. Some of them resembled spirals. Others formed elongated arcs that intersected at strange angles. None matched any written language stored in the Terran Survey database. Yet the patterns carried a certain rhythm that suggested meaning. A culture, a civilization, perhaps even a history recorded in stone long before humans ever looked toward this star system. Ethan straightened slowly and looked toward the narrow corridor between the cliffs. That was where she had gone. The entrance stood nearly 40 feet tall, a dark opening carved naturally between the frozen towers of rock. From where he stood, he could see only a short distance inside before the passage curved out of sight. He hesitated there for a moment, considering the possibilities. If the mysterious woman wanted to avoid him, she could have disappeared across the open plains where he would never catch up. Instead, she had retreated into a place where he could easily follow, almost as if she wanted him to come closer. Ethan took another step forward and crossed the threshold into the shadow of the corridor. The temperature inside the passage dropped immediately, the sunlight fading as the tall cliffs blocked the sky above. His suit lights activated automatically, casting a soft white glow across the icy walls. The corridor curved gently to the left after about 20 yards. As Ethan moved deeper into the passage, a strange sensation settled over him again. The same feeling he had experienced near the cave. The quiet certainty that someone nearby was watching his every movement. Then he heard it. A faint sound behind him. Not the wind. Not the shifting ice. A soft step across the frozen ground. Ethan turned slowly. And for the first time since the storm began, the blue-skinned woman was standing only a few feet away. The blue-skinned woman stood so close that Ethan Carter could hear the faint sound of her breathing beneath the quiet hum of his suit systems. For a moment, neither of them moved. The narrow ice corridor trapped the pale light of his suit lamp against the frozen walls, reflecting it across her luminous skin in soft, shifting patterns. She was taller than he expected, easily 6.5 feet. Her posture perfectly balanced, as if gravity itself had less hold on her than it did on him. Long strands of silver hair drifted slowly around her shoulders, untouched by the cold air moving through the passage. Ethan forced himself to stay still, resisting the instinct to step backward even though the sudden appearance had startled him. Up close, the details were even more remarkable. Her skin carried a faint glow beneath the surface, like light moving under deep ocean water. Her eyes, the same amber color he had seen from across the valley, studied him carefully without hostility. There was caution there, curiosity as well, but no aggression. Ethan slowly raised both hands, palms open, the universal gesture humans used when they wanted to show they meant no harm. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said calmly, speaking through the external audio transmitter on his helmet so she could hear him clearly. His voice echoed softly through the icy corridor. The woman did not respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him as if measuring every small movement he made. Ethan noticed that she kept a careful distance of about 6 feet between them, almost as if she was deliberately avoiding getting any closer. After several long seconds, she took one slow step backward, not retreating in fear, more like maintaining space. Ethan lowered his hands a little, but kept his posture relaxed. "You saved me during the storm," he continued quietly. "You pulled me into the cave." The woman's eyes shifted briefly toward the corridor entrance behind him, where pale daylight filtered through the ice. For a moment, Ethan wondered if she might disappear again the way she had before. Instead, she remained where she was. The silence between them stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Then something unexpected happened. The woman spoke. Her voice was soft, almost musical, carrying a tone that felt unfamiliar yet strangely precise as the translator inside Ethan's suit struggled to interpret the language patterns. "Human, you should not have followed." The translation arrived in fragments through the helmet speakers, the system adjusting rapidly as it mapped her speech patterns. Ethan blinked once, surprised not only that she spoke, but that the translator could partially understand her. "I did not mean to intrude," he replied carefully. I only wanted to thank you. The blue-skinned woman watched him with that same quiet focus. Up close, Ethan noticed faint patterns running along her arms and neck, delicate lines in her skin that shimmered faintly like frost crystals. They were not scars. They looked more like natural markings. You are far from your world, she said slowly. The translator rendered the sentence more clearly this time as it learned from the conversation. Ethan nodded slightly. Yes, I came here to study the planet. Her eyes moved past him briefly toward the valley outside, as if she were checking something in the distance. Then her gaze returned to him. You should leave this place. The words were calm, not threatening, but they carried a quiet certainty that made Ethan pause. Why? He asked. The woman hesitated. For the first time her expression changed slightly, the caution in her eyes deepening into something that almost looked like concern. She took another small step backward again, keeping the distance between them exactly the same. Because humans do not survive here. Ethan felt a faint smile form behind the visor. I already survived one storm, he said. For a brief moment the corners of her eyes shifted as if the statement had surprised her. Then she spoke again, her voice even softer than before. That was not what I meant. The corridor fell silent once more. Ethan studied her expression carefully, realizing that whatever reason she had for avoiding him earlier, it was far more complicated than simple fear. The silence in the frozen corridor stretched longer than Ethan Carter expected, the pale glow from his suit lamp reflecting across the ice walls while the blue-skinned woman stood motionless several feet away. Her words lingered in the air between them. That was not what I meant. Ethan studied her expression through the visor of his helmet, trying to understand what she was not saying. The translator in his suit continued processing the unfamiliar language patterns she used, quietly improving with every sentence. If you are worried about the storms, Ethan said carefully, keeping his tone calm, I have equipment designed for extreme environments. The woman shook her head slightly, the silver strands of her hair drifting like soft light around her shoulders. The storms are not the danger. Her voice remained gentle but certain. Ethan frowned slightly behind the visor. Then what is? For a moment she did not answer. Instead her gaze moved past him again toward the corridor entrance where the distant valley shimmered under the cold sun. When she looked back at him, the caution in her amber eyes had deepened into something heavier. Something older. Your presence here awakens things that should remain quiet. The translator hesitated on the final word before settling on the closest match it could find. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Awakens what? The woman took another careful step backward, once again preserving the distance between them with deliberate precision. Ethan noticed the pattern now. Every time he shifted forward, even slightly, she adjusted her position to maintain the same 6-foot gap. Not fear. Not hostility. Avoidance. Long ago, she said slowly, others came from the stars as you have. They did not listen when they were told to leave. Ethan felt the scientist in him sharpen immediately. Evidence of previous contact. That alone could rewrite the entire survey report about this world. Other humans? He asked. She paused before answering. Not exactly. Her eyes moved briefly to the carved symbols along the corridor walls, their ancient curves glowing faintly in the reflected light. But they were explorers. Curious. Like you. Ethan followed her gaze to the carvings. Up close he could see that the symbols continued deep into the passage beyond them, forming long flowing patterns across the frozen stone. You made these, he said quietly. The woman did not confirm it directly, but the way her eyes softened slightly told him enough. This place was part of her world, part of her history. Ethan felt a quiet realization settle over him then. She was not just someone living on this planet. She belonged to whatever civilization had carved these markings thousands of years ago. Are there others like you here? He asked. For the first time a faint shadow crossed her expression. Not anger. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to loneliness. No, the single word echoed softly through the corridor. Ethan absorbed that answer slowly. The empty plains outside suddenly felt much larger in his mind. Then you are alone here. She did not respond, but the silence confirmed it. Ethan took a small step forward without thinking. Instantly she moved back again, maintaining the careful space between them. This time he noticed something else as well. A faint shimmer in the air between them. Almost invisible, like heat rising from warm pavement on a summer day back on Earth. The effect lasted only a second before fading. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had truly seen it. The woman noticed his reaction immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly with concern. "Do not come closer," she said softly. The words were not a command. They sounded more like a warning. Ethan stopped moving and raised his hands again slightly to show he understood. "All right," he said gently. "I will stay here." For several seconds the two of them remained facing each other across the frozen corridor, separated by that strange, invisible boundary neither of them crossed. Then the woman spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "Human, why did you come to this world alone?" Ethan exhaled slowly inside his helmet and glanced briefly toward the distant valley outside. Because someone had to be the first to understand it. The woman studied him in silence, and for the first time since they met, Ethan saw something new appear in her glowing amber eyes. Not caution, not distance, something closer to respect. The quiet respect in the blue-skinned woman's glowing eyes lingered for only a moment before the caution returned again, as if some invisible rule reminded her not to let the distance between them fade. Ethan Carter noticed the change immediately. Whatever connection had just appeared between them was fragile, balanced on something he still did not understand. The frozen corridor remained silent except for the low hum of his suit systems and the faint whisper of air moving through the narrow passage. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, but kept his distance exactly where she seemed comfortable. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said calmly. "I only want to learn about this world." The woman studied him for several seconds before answering. "Your kind always says this." The translator inside his helmet rendered the sentence clearly now, its algorithms adapting rapidly to her speech patterns. Ethan felt a small breath leave his chest. "Then others have come before." She nodded slowly. "A long time ago." Her gaze moved briefly toward the glowing carvings on the corridor walls, as though the ancient symbols themselves carried memories she could still see. "They arrived with curiosity, just like you. They believed knowledge meant ownership." Ethan frowned slightly. "Humans." Again she hesitated. "Some were. Some were not." The answer raised more questions than it solved. Ethan glanced again at the carvings stretching along the walls of the passage. "These markings, they record your history, do they not?" The woman followed his gaze, and for the first time a faint warmth softened her expression. "Yes." Ethan took a slow breath. "Then this place is not just part of your world." He looked deeper into the corridor where the passage curved out of sight. "It is something like a sanctuary." The word seemed to interest her. She studied him more carefully now, as if measuring how much he truly understood. "You learn quickly, human." Ethan gave a small shrug. "That is the job." For a moment something almost like amusement flickered in her amber eyes, though it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. The strange, shimmering distortion in the air between them returned again for a brief instant, bending the light from his suit lamp in soft waves before fading away. Ethan noticed it this time more clearly. It was not heat, not radiation from his equipment. It seemed to come from her direction, forming an invisible boundary she carefully avoided crossing. The realization stirred new curiosity in his mind. "That space between us," he said gently. "You keep it for a reason." The woman's expression tightened slightly. "Yes." Ethan waited, sensing she might explain more if he remained patient. After several seconds she spoke again. "If you value your life, you will not step closer." The statement was not dramatic or threatening. It sounded like simple fact. Ethan considered that carefully. Every instinct in his scientific training pushed him to understand the phenomenon he had just observed. But another part of him recognized the seriousness in her voice. "All right," he said quietly. "I will respect that." The woman seemed to relax slightly at the answer. The corridor fell silent again as the pale sunlight outside the passage slowly shifted across the ice walls. Ethan glanced toward the entrance where the valley stretched beyond the cliffs, then back to her. "You never told me your name." She hesitated for a moment, as though deciding whether sharing it mattered. Then she answered softly. "Lasara." Ethan repeated it slowly. "Lasara." The name carried a graceful rhythm unfamiliar to human language. The translator recorded the sound and stored it. "I am glad to meet you," he said. Lasara looked at him carefully when he said that. For the first time since they had met, the caution in her eyes softened just a little more. Then her attention shifted suddenly toward the corridor entrance again. Ethan followed her gaze. A low vibration moved through the frozen ground beneath his boots, so faint he almost missed it. Lasara's expression changed instantly. The calm presence she carried before vanished, replaced by urgent concern. She looked back at Ethan. Human, you should have left this planet when you had the chance. Ethan felt the vibration again beneath the ice, stronger this time, as though something deep beneath the frozen world had begun to wake. The faint vibration beneath Ethan Carter's boots grew stronger, spreading through the frozen corridor like a distant echo moving under miles of ancient ice. At first it was subtle, barely more than a tremor passing through the stone walls, but within seconds the sensation deepened into a steady pulse that Ethan could feel through the reinforced soles of his exploration suit. He glanced down at the ground instinctively as the suit sensors began displaying minor seismic activity across the corner of his visor. That is not normal tectonic movement, he said quietly. Lasara was already looking toward the corridor entrance, her expression sharpened by urgency. The gentle calm she carried earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by focused awareness. The silver strands of her hair drifted slightly, as if responding to currents Ethan could not feel. It has sensed you, she said softly. The translator delivered the words clearly this time. Ethan frowned behind the visor. What has sensed me? Another pulse moved through the ground, stronger now, causing tiny fragments of frost to slide down the ice walls around them. The glowing carvings along the corridor flickered briefly in the reflected light as the stone vibrated. Lasara turned her gaze back to him. The world itself. Ethan blinked once, unsure whether the translator had misinterpreted her words. You mean the planet? She nodded once. This world has slept for a very long time. The structures you see around you were created by my people to calm what lies beneath the ice. Ethan felt a slow realization forming in his mind. The ancient carvings. The endless silence of the planet. The way Lasara had watched him from a distance as if guarding something rather than simply observing. You are not just protecting this place, he said quietly. You are protecting something under it. Lasara did not answer directly, but her silence confirmed more than any explanation could have. Another tremor passed beneath the frozen ground, lasting longer this time. Ethan's suit display registered the movement immediately, drawing thin yellow lines across the seismic monitor. If this world reacts to outside activity, Ethan said, thinking quickly, then my landing must have triggered something. Lasara's glowing eyes held his steadily. Yes. The simple answer carried no accusation, only certainty. Ethan exhaled slowly inside his helmet. Then I need to return to my shuttle and leave. Lasara shook her head gently. You will not reach it in time. Ethan turned toward the corridor entrance where pale sunlight still spilled across the valley floor. His navigation beacon blinked faintly across the corner of his visor. 1.8 miles away. In normal conditions, he could cover that distance in under an hour. But the ground beneath them vibrated again, stronger now, as though enormous pressure was shifting somewhere far below the surface. Ethan turned back to her. Then what do we do? Lasara hesitated before answering. When she spoke again, her voice carried something Ethan had not heard before. Reluctance. There is a place deeper within these cliffs where the old systems still function. It may quiet the awakening long enough for you to escape. Ethan looked deeper into the shadowed corridor behind her where the passage curved out of sight. The glowing carvings continued along the walls in intricate patterns that seemed to grow more complex the farther they extended into the mountain. You built all of this to keep the planet asleep, he said. Lasara gave a small nod. My people did. Ethan studied her carefully. But they are gone now. Her eyes lowered slightly, confirming the truth he already suspected. She was the last guardian of something ancient and dangerous beneath the ice. Another tremor rolled through the corridor then, stronger than before, causing a thin sheet of frost to break loose from the ceiling and scatter across the ground. Ethan steadied himself instinctively. Lasara looked toward the deeper passage again, her expression resolute. If you wish to survive, human, she said quietly, you must trust me. Ethan Carter glanced once more toward the distant valley and the unreachable shuttle beacon blinking faintly through the ice cliffs. Then he looked back at the blue-skinned guardian standing several feet away, the invisible space still separating them like an unseen barrier. Finally, he nodded once. Lead the way. The next tremor rolled through the frozen corridor just as Ethan Carter finished speaking, deeper and longer than the ones before. A slow, powerful vibration that moved through the stone beneath his boots like the distant turning of something enormous far below the surface. Tiny crystals of ice rattled loose from the carved walls and scattered across the ground, while the ancient symbols etched into the stone shimmered faintly in the reflected glow of Ethan's suit lamp. Lasara turned without hesitation and began moving deeper into the corridor, her tall blue form gliding silently across the frozen floor while maintaining the careful distance between them. Ethan followed immediately, adjusting his pace so that he stayed several feet behind her without closing the invisible boundary she had warned him about earlier. The passage curved gradually downward into the mountain, the air growing colder and stiller the farther they traveled from the valley entrance. Ethan's visor display flickered with new sensor readings as his suit detected unusual energy patterns within the rock walls around them. "These carvings," he said quietly while walking, "they are not just decoration." Lasara did not slow her pace. "They are part of the control system." Ethan's eyes moved along the flowing symbols stretching across the corridor. The shapes seemed more complex now, layered in overlapping arcs and spirals that formed enormous patterns across the ice walls like a language designed to communicate with the planet itself. "Your people built an entire network to regulate what lies beneath the ice," he said thoughtfully. "Yes." Her answer was simple, but Ethan could hear the weight behind it. Another tremor moved through the ground beneath them as they continued forward, causing the suit sensors to register a stronger seismic spike across the corner of Ethan's visor. The readings were rising steadily. Whatever slept beneath the frozen world was becoming more aware of the disturbance above. The corridor opened suddenly into a vast chamber carved deep inside the mountain. Ethan stopped instinctively when he stepped inside. The ceiling rose nearly 60 feet above them, supported by towering columns of ancient ice and stone that glowed faintly with embedded crystalline structures. The carvings here were far more intricate than the ones in the passage behind them, forming enormous circular patterns that radiated outward across the walls and floor like the internal workings of a massive machine. In the center of the chamber stood a raised platform shaped from smooth black stone. Lasara moved toward it without hesitation. Ethan remained several steps back while watching carefully, his suit lamp casting long shadows across the floor. The vibration beneath the chamber pulsed again, stronger this time. Lasara placed one glowing blue hand against the surface of the central platform. For a moment nothing happened. Then the carvings surrounding the room began to glow softly with pale silver light, the ancient symbols awakening in response to her touch. Ethan watched in silent amazement as the patterns along the walls illuminated one by one like a chain of living circuits connecting the entire chamber together. "It is responding to you," he said quietly. Lasara did not look back at him. "It recognizes the last voice of my people." The chamber vibrated again as the glowing symbols intensified, their light flowing outward through the carvings like energy moving through veins beneath the stone. Ethan's suit sensors registered a rapid drop in the seismic readings on his display. The trembling beneath the mountain was beginning to slow. For a moment it seemed the system might succeed in calming whatever lay beneath the frozen planet. Then Ethan noticed something change in Lasara's posture. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, as if she had sensed something new. The glowing lines around the chamber flickered once. Then again, Ethan's visor flashed a new alert across the corner of his display. "External signal detected. Approaching from orbit." Ethan turned his head instinctively toward the ceiling of the chamber, as if he could somehow see through miles of ice and rock above them. His ship had not sent that signal, and he knew immediately what that meant. They were no longer alone on this world. The alert flashing across Ethan Carter's visor pulsed bright amber against the dim glow of the ancient chamber, its message repeating again as his suit attempted to identify the signal. "External vessel detected. Orbital descent pattern confirmed." Ethan felt a slow tightening in his chest as he stared at the data scrolling across the corner of his display. His shuttle was still sitting nearly 2 miles away across the frozen valley, and it was the only registered human craft anywhere near this system, which meant the signal now approaching from orbit belonged to someone else. Lasara sensed the change immediately. The glowing patterns across the chamber floor continued to pulse beneath her hand, while the ancient system tried to calm the stirring deep beneath the ice. But her attention had shifted completely to Ethan. "You were not alone when you came to this world," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head once. No, I came alone. He turned his visor toward the far wall of the chamber where the carvings spiraled upward into the ice like enormous frozen constellations. The signal warning continued blinking on his display as the incoming vessel adjusted its descent trajectory. But it looks like someone followed me. Lasara studied him carefully, as if weighing the truth in his words. The ones who came before you also believed they were explorers. Ethan felt the implication immediately. You think they are the same kind. Another tremor moved through the chamber, lighter now as the ancient system continued stabilizing the planet's deep vibrations. The glowing lines beneath Lasara's hand brightened for a moment, flowing outward across the chamber floor like spreading light beneath the ice. Yet her expression had grown more tense. If more outsiders arrive, she said softly, the world will awaken fully. Ethan understood the danger immediately. The system they had just activated was only calming the disturbance triggered by his own arrival. If additional ships began landing across the surface, the ancient safeguards buried within the planet might not be able to contain the reaction beneath the ice. Can your system stop them from landing? Ethan asked. Lasara's glowing amber eyes shifted briefly toward the ceiling as though she could sense the approaching craft through miles of frozen rock above them. No, the single word echoed gently through the chamber. Ethan glanced again at the signal display on his visor. The incoming vessel was descending quickly now, its transponder still silent. Whoever was arriving did not intend to announce themselves. They are probably detecting the same energy signals that brought me here, Ethan said quietly. The carvings, the structures. To explorers, this planet looks like a lost civilization waiting to be discovered. Lasara looked back at him with an expression that carried both understanding and sorrow. And some discoveries should remain buried. Another pulse of light moved through the chamber floor as the ancient control system completed another stabilization cycle. The seismic readings on Ethan's visor dropped further, indicating the deep movements beneath the ice were slowing. For the moment, the planet was calming again. But the approaching vessel was now less than 30 miles above the surface. Ethan could see its trajectory forming clearly across his display. They will land near my shuttle, he said. Lasara removed her hand slowly from the glowing platform. The symbols across the chamber continued to shine faintly, maintaining the system's hold on the sleeping force beneath the planet. She turned toward Ethan again, the distance between them still carefully preserved. Then we must reach them before they reach the valley. Ethan raised an eyebrow behind his visor. You want to meet them? Lasara's eyes held his steadily. I want them to leave. Ethan considered that carefully. A few hours ago, he had been the only outsider on this frozen world. Now there was another ship descending from the stars, and he had no idea whether its crew came with curiosity, greed, or something far worse. The signal warning on his visor shifted again as the vessel began its final descent toward the surface. Ethan Carter looked at the ancient chamber one last time, then back at the blue-skinned guardian who had protected this world alone for thousands of years. Finally he nodded. Then we had better move quickly. The tremor beneath the frozen chamber had almost faded when Ethan Carter and Lasara stepped back into the narrow corridor, yet the tension in the air had not disappeared. The ancient system buried within the cliffs continued to glow softly behind them, its quiet pulses traveling through the carved symbols along the walls like a sleeping heartbeat. For now the world beneath the ice was calm again. But the signal on Ethan's visor told a different story. The incoming vessel had already entered the upper atmosphere. Ethan moved quickly through the corridor beside Lasara, careful not to cross the invisible boundary she maintained between them. The long passage sloped upward toward the valley entrance, the pale daylight growing stronger with each step. The vessel is less than 10 miles above the surface now, Ethan said while watching the descending marker on his display. They are coming down fast. Lasara did not slow her pace. Her tall figure moved smoothly through the icy passage as if she had walked these corridors thousands of times before. They will search for the energy signals your arrival activated. Ethan nodded. Explorers always follow the strongest readings first. The corridor opened again toward the valley where Ethan had first seen her standing across the frozen cliffs. The sky above the ice fields had changed since they entered the mountain. Thick gray clouds had begun gathering along the horizon, swirling slowly around a faint streak of light descending from the upper atmosphere. Even from miles away, Ethan could see the glow of thrusters cutting through the cold sky like a falling star. The approaching vessel was large, larger than a typical survey shuttle. Ethan felt a quiet unease settle in his mind. That ship is not a research craft, he said. Lasara followed his gaze upward. The distant light reflected softly in her amber eyes. Then they did not come for knowledge. Ethan watched the descending vessel carefully while his suit sensors attempted to analyze its energy signature. The readings were unfamiliar. No Terran registry matched the pattern. Whoever was arriving here had either disabled their transponder or never intended to identify themselves in the first place. The light in the sky grew brighter as the craft descended through the cloud layer, its engines casting long glowing trails across the frozen valley below. Ethan's shuttle beacon blinked quietly on his display less than 2 miles away. The new vessel was heading directly toward the same location. They must have detected my shuttle landing, Ethan said quietly, or the energy surge when the ancient system activated. Lasara stepped forward onto the valley ice and looked across the endless white plains toward the distant ridge where Ethan's shuttle waited. Her expression had grown calm again, but the seriousness in her voice remained. If they reach the carvings, the world beneath the ice will awaken again. Ethan understood the danger clearly now. The system they had just stabilized was ancient and delicate. Another disturbance like the one his arrival caused could push the planet beyond the threshold Lasara's people had designed to contain it. He looked back toward the descending vessel. It was now less than a mile above the valley floor, slowing its descent as it searched for a landing zone near the cliffs. Ethan took a slow breath inside his helmet. Then we need to reach them first. Lasara turned toward him, the faint shimmering boundary still separating them by several careful steps. For a moment neither of them spoke while the distant roar of descending engines echoed faintly across the frozen landscape. Finally Lasara gave a small nod. Yes. Ethan Carter turned his visor toward the distant shuttle beacon blinking across the valley. The frozen plain stretched nearly 2 miles between them and the landing site where the unknown craft would arrive within minutes. The wind had begun rising again across the ice, carrying long sheets of drifting frost across the ground. Ethan adjusted the power output on his suit servos and took his first step across the valley. Then let us go introduce ourselves. The wind across the frozen valley had grown stronger by the time Ethan Carter and Lasara reached the midpoint of the ice plain. Long ribbons of drifting frost sweeping across the surface like pale ghosts racing over glass. Above them, the descending vessel had slowed to a steady hover nearly 800 feet above the ground, its thrusters glowing white against the darkening clouds as it scanned the valley below. Ethan could now see the outline of the craft clearly through his visor. It was long and angular, far larger than a civilian exploration shuttle, with reinforced landing struts unfolding beneath its hull as it prepared to descend near the cluster of cliffs where Ethan's own shuttle waited. The engines hummed across the valley with a low metallic resonance that carried through the frozen air. Ethan glanced down at the navigation display on his visor. His shuttle beacon blinked steadily less than half a mile ahead now. The unknown craft would reach it in less than 2 minutes. They are almost here, Ethan said quietly while continuing forward across the ice. Lasara moved beside him with the same effortless grace she had shown since the moment they met, her long silver hair drifting in the rising wind while the faint glow beneath her blue skin shimmered softly against the gray sky. Yet even now she maintained the same careful distance between them, never stepping close enough to cross the invisible boundary she had warned him about. Ethan had stopped questioning that boundary. He trusted that whatever reason she had for keeping it existed for both their safety. The thrusters of the approaching vessel brightened suddenly as the craft lowered itself toward the valley floor. A cloud of frozen dust lifted from the ice where its engines pushed downward, spreading outward in slow spirals across the plain. The landing struts touched the ground with a deep metallic thud that echoed faintly through the cliffs. Ethan slowed his pace slightly as he studied the vessel through the visor sensors. No visible insignia. No registry code. The hull plating looked heavy, reinforced for long-distance operations rather than scientific survey. That ship was built for extraction, Ethan murmured. Lasara turned her glowing amber eyes toward the vessel as well. Then they believe something valuable lies beneath this world. Ethan nodded slowly. And they are probably right. The distant ramp of the landed craft began lowering toward the ice, releasing a thin line of vapor into the cold air as internal pressure equalized with the atmosphere. Ethan stopped walking when they were still nearly 300 yards from the ship. From here he could see his own shuttle sitting quietly near the cliffs behind the newly arrived vessel, half buried in wind-blown frost. The open ramp of the larger craft glowed faintly with interior lights. For several seconds nothing happened. Then shapes appeared inside the opening. Figures, tall silhouettes wearing heavy exploration suits, stepped down onto the frozen ground one by one, their helmets reflecting the pale light of the sky. Ethan counted 4 of them. Each carried scanning equipment mounted along their arms and shoulders as they began surveying the valley floor. "They are already searching," Ethan said softly. Lasara watched them with calm intensity, her expression unreadable as the wind moved through the frozen valley around them. The strange, shimmering distortion in the air between her and Ethan flickered again, briefly before fading. Ethan noticed the movement of the distant explorers pause suddenly as their scanners detected something unexpected. One of the figures turned directly toward the direction where Ethan and Lasara stood across the ice plain. Even from 300 yards away, Ethan could see the hesitation in the figure's posture. They had seen them. The explorers gathered together near the base of the ramp, their attention now fully focused across the valley. For a moment, the entire frozen world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan Carter stood beside the last guardian of an ancient planet while strangers from the stars stared across the ice toward them. And for the first time since arriving on this world, Ethan realized something that made the cold wind feel even sharper against his suit. Whatever happened next would decide whether this frozen planet remained asleep forever or awakened once more.